Welcome, everyone. My name is Althea Brooks. I'm Senior Director of Lifetime Learning in the University of Virginia's Office of Engagement. I'm pleased you can join us for this program on Speaking of America, a conversation with knowledge experts. We're delighted to have three scholars for this discussion this afternoon. The Speaking of America docuseries instructor, Mary Kate Cary, is serving as moderator for this program. I'll briefly introduce her shortly. Mary Kate is joined by UVA McIntyre School of Commerce professor Robert Patterson and the College of Charleston professor Michael Lee. Should you have a question during the program, please submit it in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Today's talk is being recorded and will be posted in the Lifetime Learning's podcast library in a week or so. Now allow me to briefly introduce our moderator. Mary Kate Cary is Assistant Vice President in the University of Virginia's Office of the President. Previously, Mary Kate served as lecturer in the Politics Department at UVA, teaching political speech writing, Democracy Out Loud, and Election 2024, which she co-taught alongside a professor with opposing views. She's the director of Think Again UVA, an initiative that promotes freedom of expression, viewpoint diversity, critical thinking, and intellectual humility through student-facing programming. Ms. Cary is a former White House speechwriter for President George H.W. Bush and served as spokesman for the U.S. Attorney General William Barr in 1992. For over 2 decades, that's right, 2 decades, she wrote speeches for a variety of national political and business leaders. She is the executive producer of the award-winning documentary 41 on 41, in which 41 extraordinary people told their best stories about former President Bush 41. Again, thank you, panel, for being with us today. Mary Kate, the microphone is all yours.
Thank you, Althea. It's a joy to be with you today. And I thought maybe I would start things off with a quick story of how this all came about. How did Speaking of America come to be? And it started when my daughters were at the National Cathedral School, which you may have heard when we did the George W. Bush speech after 9/11. My daughters were at the all-girls school at the National Cathedral, and the oldest one was in 6th grade in Mrs. Simchek's English literature class. And she came to me and said, the theme this year for the lit class is going to be the heroic journey. And we're going to start with the Iliad and the Odyssey, and we're going to end with Raisin in the Sun. And she says, are there any speeches that illustrate the heroic journey? Is there something we could use there? And I said, oh, probably the greatest speech on the heroic journey is Reagan at Normandy on the 40th anniversary of D-Day, where he talks about the boys of Pointe du Hoc who climbed the cliffs of Normandy and saved civilization from Hitler. And that would be a great speech to do. And by the way, Reagan gave the speech, but it was written by a woman, Peggy Noonan. And I think it would be important for the young women in the 6th grade to know that women can be speechwriters for presidents. And so she said, that would be great. And that was the first time I ever researched and wrote about a historical speech. I would argue one of the greatest speeches in the 20th century. And funny story, as we were going through it line by line with the 6th graders, I said to the girls, does anybody know why the word Providence is in here and is capitalized? Does anyone know what Providence means? Because the line was something about Providence is on our side in the speech. And one of the girls raised her hand and said, oh, yes, Mrs. Cary, the reason Providence is capitalized is because it is the capital of Rhode Island. And I said, yes, you are correct. It is the capital of Rhode Island, but that's not why it's capitalized in this speech. And we had a long conversation about providence meaning the hand of God. But that ignited in me this idea of learning about the great speeches. As Althea just said, I had freelanced for 20, 25 years in Washington, writing for all kinds of people. But I was sort of a tradesman, if anything. I wrote for the next client, whatever they needed. I didn't have the ability to stop and start doing deep dives on great speeches in American history. But that incident in the sixth grade made me realize this is fascinating, and I started buying books of the greatest speeches in American history and started reading interviews of previous speechwriters and things like that. And that grew into, by 2019, I started teaching this class at UVA called Democracy Out Loud, which was basically the greatest speeches. And that is how it morphed into Speaking of America, because there was a 100-person wait list to get into Democracy Out Loud. The students wanted to know about the great speeches, and I had to turn them away because it was only a class for 20 people. So that's what started this idea of how can we bring this to more people, and that became a video series. I do want to say that this is part of our 250th celebration of the Declaration of Independence and the birth of our nation here at UVA. This is one of the ways we're celebrating it. I want to say thanks to the team of student researchers and Sarah Hart, who particularly helped lead that with all of the fact checking and making sure that all of our sources were good. We have an unbelievable production team, as you can probably tell, of cameramen and video editors at Night for Night Productions, which has done a spectacular job with all these images and the stories. And then finally, this great partnership with UVA Engagements, who has really been sort of the cherry on top of this whole thing, distributing it to so many people across our country. So thank you to Engagements. So let's get started. My guests today, hopefully, are going to join us here, and they are Michael Lee. He's the director of the Civility Initiative and a professor of communications at the College of Charleston. There he is. He's an expert on great speeches in American history. He has written multiple award-winning books and hosts a podcast called When We Disagree, about memorable disagreements in our lives. I would say he is not a disagreeable person. He's actually very charming. So, but you'll see how he behaves now. But he specializes in interesting disagreements. Rob Patterson is here at the University of Virginia and is at the McIntire School of Business, our undergraduate business school. He's in the management communications program and has taught many classes over the years on rhetoric, communications, public speaking, and like Professor Lee, Professor Patterson is an expert on historical speeches and writing. And it's an honor to have both of them join us today. So welcome to both of you.
Thank you, Mary Kate. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, everyone.
So what we're thinking is, why don't we do 3 poll questions to our audience, and each one will be a different session in our Collection A of speeches, and we will ask you, the audience, which ones were your favorite speeches in each little subset. So we'll have three subsets. And let's put the first poll question up, and we'd love to hear from you in that first section of speeches. There's 4 of them, called Words That Sparked a Movement. There it is. Please let us know which one was your favorite of those 4, and then we'll tell you the answer from your fellow audience members, and then the panelists will tell us what their choices would be.
How fun this will be.
Oh, yeah, I think it's going to be fascinating to see which ones the audience likes and which ones we like. But we don't want to give you our answers first. We also were joking about maybe we should put this on the prediction markets and we could make some money. But we'll forego that today.
Mary Kate, as that's coming up, I would just like to thank you so much for curating such a wonderful collection of speeches for us to sink our teeth into and to allow us to interact with the audience and those that are taking your course.
Well, thank you, Rob. And I think the thing that's amazing to me is you can find most of these speeches on the internet, but you can't find the stories behind them, which I think is amazing. Because I think that's the joy of this, is that each one of these is one person who saw that somebody had to speak up, and what were they going to say and how were they going to say it? And why was it them and not someone else? Why was it in this venue, not someplace else? And did it live on? Did it have an effect? And I think that's the fun part of this is all the stories behind it. Okay, here we go.
Oh, wow.
Here's some results. Okay, so our first place winner is Martin Luther King Jr.'s "I Have a Dream." Second place, Patrick Henry, "Give Me Liberty or Give Me Death." And then third place, Harvey Milk's "That's What America Is." And then Ronald Reagan, "Time for Choosing," bringing up the rear.
Huh.
Uh, okay, so let's start. Michael, what would have been your first choice? We're not allowed to vote on paper, so but we can vote verbally. What would your vote have been?
Well, I'll give an argument for the Yankees, which in this case is Martin Luther King's "I Have a Dream" speech. Arguably the iconic speech in American political history for good reason. When I work with students on this speech, of course, we talk, of course, about the delivery. It's very slow, it's very sermonic. But really, what stands out to me is the artistry of his language. Over the course of the next hour or so, we'll talk about a lot about this speech, but a few things stand out to me. One of which is his use of what rhetoricians call anaphora, which is the repetition of the same word or phrase at the beginning of successive sentences in a row as a use of helping the audience's memory, but also to build drama. And so much of the lines that we know from the speech, whether it is "Let Freedom Ring" or "I Have a Dream," is a kind of structured series of anaphoras throughout the whole speech. And so if you really ask what gives the language the color and nuance in the "I Have a Dream" speech, it is that. It is anaphora over and over again. And just to speak up for the loser of that one too, there's maybe no speech on this entire list gives the speaker an immediate national credibility that changes the course of American political history, like Reagan's "A Time for Choosing" speech. And so maybe pales a little bit in comparison in terms of the artistry of the language, but in terms of the seismic force of presidential politics, of which Mary Kate Cary was a part, arguable that it's the most important of these speeches in our lifetime.
Wow. Okay, going from the first pick to the last pick. Okay, how about you, Rob?
Well, I wish I could do MLK's "I Have a Dream 2.0 because I totally agree with Michael. And AmericanRhetoric.com says that this is the best speech of the 20th century.
Mm.
And that's a site that I know all three of us access and have our students access. Picking up on the thread of Michael's point about Reagan's "A Time for Choosing," it's so spot on what he says because I hadn't really thought about that speech honestly in a few years. And I know some people just simply call it the speech. But in terms of creating a tectonic shift, that speech is quite incredible in terms of what you think, when you think about the impact of sparking essentially the modern conservative movement. That particular speech is incredible. But I'm going to go with number two. I'm going to bounce around here and go with Patrick Henry's "Give Me Liberty or Give Me Death," just because it was number two in the polling, but it's also the spark that created so much of what our country is about. And there's Michael talked about anaphora. And there's a lot of that in this speech too. Things like "we have petitioned, we have supplicated, we have prostrated." And then he goes on and says, "We have been slighted, we have been disregarded, we have been spurned." And the language there is just so powerful. I like it too because I teach our students in commerce to write and speak briefly. And this speech, like the Gettysburg Address, which I know is the speech that you're ending this whole series on in June, is short and it's brief. And I really appreciate that brevity and the force of those words given at that time just are so impactful and so meaningful, I think, to us as Americans, as Virginians, as we start to celebrate and continue to celebrate our nation's 250th.
Yeah, I would second that. My choice. This is hard for me though. It's just like asking me to choose my favorite child. Like they're all my favorite speeches, so I like them all. But I do think if we're talking about words that sparked a movement, this, as I say in the video, this is the one that sparked them all, and we wouldn't have any of these other speeches in American history if the American Revolution had not taken place. And the fact that there are years later, centuries later, as we saw the images of Tiananmen Square with people in Tiananmen Square saying, "Give me liberty or give me death." 200 years later, uh, there's no other speech in this series that was getting, because of our young history, but the fact that this speech has lived on and has become such a iconic phrase about the nature of liberty in our nation, I kind of have to go with it. Uh,
And when
but
you look at all four, and they're really elevating American freedom.
yeah,
And so it's a very interesting chronological way in which to kind of frame these speeches as well as the evolution of freedom.
and we haven't said anything about Harvey Milk, but that is a very pro-America, pro-Declaration of Independence speech.
Yep.
Even though he was very angry as he was giving it, it's a similar argument as Martin Luther King in terms of the uncashed check, the promissory note. Very similar type of argument about this is what our country is all about and why not for me. It goes to I am a man with the abolitionists, I think. So
Right.
fascinating.
He cites the Declaration, the Star Spangled Banner, the Statue of Liberty. He just is basically, in so many ways, talking about, as you said, the evolution of freedom, but also bigotry. And so it's very pro-US in the sense, pro-American in the sense that it's reflecting back on these founding principles and documents, and also trying to, I think, shake the American people into thinking about how do you enfranchise, a whole category of people. And so in that way, the Harvey Milk speech is critically important in
And
this
picking up
population.
on that theme too, Rob, and it's so well said, is one of the things that a lot of these speeches do, and since we're on the topic of milk, we can talk about the way that these speeches call forth an American canon. What kinds of evidence of our collective existence do they use? Because there's a kind of tacit statement in so many of these speeches that say, we have all come through the following trials and tribulations as Americans. We all honor the same sacred totems and rituals and iconic images. So we talk about the American civil religious canon of the Declaration. To some extent, I Have a Dream is a part of that, of course, the
Mm-hmm.
Constitution, and many others, right? Our presidents' lives, our leaders' lives. And Milk really does that. And the second thing that he does, that King also does, Margaret Chase Smith does, and many others, is another form of proof in rhetoric called enactment, where the speaker stands in as the proof of the very concept they are talking about, right? And so, in some ways, Obama's hope is enacted by the fact that this person is a historic candidate. The same kind of argument is enacted in Teddy Kennedy's speech that we'll talk about in a little bit. And Milk is, in ways, enacting the very thing that he's asking his audience to believe.
Speaking of Teddy Kennedy's and Margaret Chase Smith, for that matter, let's go to our second poll question for our audience, which is your favorite speech in the second session, challenging the age. And again, we are not allowed to vote on paper, so we'll watch as our audience votes, and we'll see which one comes up. But
Michael, on your point of enactment, when you started talking about that, I was thinking about JFK's speech to the Houston ministers in
Mm-hmm.
1960,
Mm-hmm.
and how he, as a celebrated war hero in the South Pacific, was enacting so much of what America's inclusiveness should be about. Of course, I don't mean to give that speech away because I know that's coming up in the next grouping in the future. But that Houston ministerial speech to me really spoke to what you were talking about in terms of this notion of enactment.
Yeah, and to that point, I think a lot of these speeches come from a place of being down power and asking for more rights, more visibility, more symbolic importance in the American story. And enactment is really powerful to that effect, right? We like to talk about the relationship between rhetoric and symbols and power. And I have to be the proof of the thing that I'm asking for if people are going to perceive the thing that I'm asking for to be revolutionary. And so for Milk, for King, for Elizabeth Cady Stanton, for John F. Kennedy as a Catholic to stand forward and say, look at me. It is self-evidently true, as Jefferson would say, it's self-evidently true that your worst fears are not, in fact, the case.
okay, here we go. Looks like we have a winner
There we go.
with Margaret
Why?
Chase Smith, Declaration of Conscience.
Look at that.
Second
Wow.
place is Thomas Jefferson's inaugural. Third place, Teddy Roosevelt's Man with the Muckrake. And bringing up the rear is Teddy Kennedy at Liberty Baptist College. Let's see. We've got one, two, three. Okay. What would you guys have voted for? Rob, why don't you start?
Sure, I'll pick at that thread again of the address by Teddy Kennedy at Liberty, then known as Liberty Baptist College instead of Liberty University. But that particular speech resonates with me because I really like the Houston ministerial speech, which I've already talked about. For me, those speeches are so important because I guess I'm drawn to speeches where you enter into a hostile audience or you engage a hostile audience. And in both of those speeches, as Michael said, they're in many ways defending their own Catholicism. And as you know, Alfred Smith in 1928 ran as a Catholic candidate, former governor of New York, and of course lost that election. And so the next time that a Catholic candidate was prominent, of course, was in 1960 with JFK. But this Ted Kennedy speech is so interesting. If you think about it, 1983 was a seminal year for religion. There was a lot of infighting within the Protestant faith. There was also some really interesting events in the Catholic Church. If you may remember, that was a Jubilee year. That was a year
Hmm.
that the door was open at St. Peter's. Pope John Paul II opened that door, and so there was just a lot of going on, and there was the nuclear um, things going on, and it just so an interesting cultural milieu in which he stepped in to defend, faith in America and the separation of church and state. And so for me, that particular speech resonates because of that connection to his brother.
By the way, just for our viewers who might not know, uh, I'm not sure everybody knows about the opening of the door at the Vatican during a Jubilee year, and I happened to be there at the 2024 Vatican when the Pope opened the door. And what people might not know is if you walk through the door, all of your sins for your whole life are forgiven. And so I did not know that in advance, and we were all joking we should have all robbed a bank the night before or something. But we did not commit extra sins before we went through the door. But that's what that means, opening the door. Anyway, Michael, what have you got?
Well, I got to get through that door, it sounds
Yeah, you got to
like.
get to the door.
Um, a couple things come up for me, both looking at the polls as well as hearing Rob and you talk. So, what I love about the Jefferson speech, the Kennedy speech, as well as the Teddy Roosevelt speech is they all seem to be about the same question, which is how should we argue together in a democracy? How can we manage norms of decorum, of politeness and respect? And how can we disagree with one another fundamentally and be respectful at the same time? How can I think that your position on my freedoms is perhaps monstrous and agree to still continue to be a citizen with you? And that's why it continues to harken back to this American canon. We're all in this together. We have a civil religion that compels us to be co-parishioners. The second thing that comes up for me in the speech that I choose, and really just because of 6 words, Jefferson's "We are all Republicans, we are all Federalists," for a few reasons, and it really calls to mind two different rhetorical devices that are related. One is connective and one is dissociative. And so the parallel structure of "We are Republicans, we are Federalists," both in terms of the composition of the language as well as the number of syllables that they're using. It also calls to mind something from a speech that Rob has talked about a couple times, the Houston Ministerial Association, which is the opposite of that parallel structure as a kind of dissociation, or what fancy rhetoricians call anti-metaboly or chiasmus. So in Houston, Kennedy would say something like, "I'm not the Catholic candidate for president. I'm the president candidate who happens to be a Catholic," a similar kind of anti-metaboly that he uses with the famous "Ask Not" line in his first inaugural address. And so for me, the if you're looking for 6 words that say there is an American canon and we're all in this together, and does so at a powerful moment of a potential schism, a really fraught presidential election really early in the country's history, as we're passing on from the old line Washington and entering a new revolutionary era, it's got to be Jefferson for me.
I'm going to go with, and by the way, can I just say on the Jefferson, I really like not every difference of opinion is a
Mm,
difference of principle.
mhm.
That is still true today. I wish more people subscribe to that. But anyway, I'm going to go with my favorite is Man with the Muckrake. And I would have to say it's because if you think about the fact that that speech is based on a metaphor in Pilgrim's Progress, I would say 90% of young people today have never heard of Pilgrim's Progress. I think back when this speech was given, everybody knew exactly what he was talking about because it was a nationwide bestseller for many, many years. And yet, if you read the message of the speech, and I've said this in my class, and you substitute in, instead of for the journalists that he's attacking, if it was social media or, Yik Yak or TikTok or X or whatever, it's a very similar message of stop looking down, which we do when we're on social media. You're looking down at your phone the whole time. Stop looking down, look up and see all the beauty in the world, all the happiness. Stop looking at all the negative that's down. And I think it's a very current message, despite the fact that it's grounded in a book that came out, a couple centuries ago. So that's my favorite, is because I think it's a universal message that still rings true today, despite it being a very different time and place that he gave it. Um,
That's a
I
good one.
also I also like the fact that he gave it at the House office building uh, dedication, and it was after going to the gridiron dinner. I think that's a great backstory that you don't get on AmericanRhetoric.com kind of thing. Um, okay, let's keep talking
He
about.
was sitting on the box, right? Is that the speech where
Yeah,
he
he
was
was. I
sitting
think he
on?
was standing on like almost literally a
Oh, standing on
soapbox.
the box.
Yeah,
Right, right,
yeah,
right. It kind of reminds me when George Bush 43 was standing at the Twin Towers after
with the
9/11
megaphone. Yeah.
with the megaphone. Exactly. Yeah. Also, to Michael's point, we are Republicans. We are all Federalists. That also echoes to me with Barbara Jordan, her speech, and I know you're going to be talking about that speech in the future during the Watergate hearings when she was
Hmm.
appealing to not our impulses to be partisan, but our impulses to be all Americans,
Mhm.
as well as the JFK speech. And then I have to say, I have to admit, the Margaret Chase Smith speech for me was one that I had not really read in a long time. And because of preparing for this particular show, it just in the webinar, I was just struck by how similar she was appealing to all Americans during that time. Obviously, that was during the Joseph McCarthy hearings. And so she gave that speech, what, in 1950?
Yep.
And then by 1954, finally the grip that Joe McCarthy had on the country was had let go. So
And by the way, another crazy story is that I never heard of this speech until I was at the White House and got assigned to write the script for President Bush to give her the Medal of Honor, and Presidential Medal of
Wow.
Honor, I guess it is. And that's when I was like, "Holy cow, she's kind of a badass." And she was
yes,
brave, and
really
I'm convinced
was.
if she hadn't done that, I'm not sure Joseph McCarthy would still be in office. And so I think
And your point in the series when she was the Air Force Reserve pilot
unbelievable.
at
Yeah,
the age of
Yeah.
60, she's getting into these aircraft.
yeah, she
Yes,
was cool. She was
And
totally
she
cool.
was wickedly cool.
a
Yeah.
very specific kind of tally point to yours about Margaret Chase Smith as well. We've talked about a few rhetorical devices. Well, she does anaphora and she does parallel structure. Maybe the standout lines of the Chase Smith speech are I speak as a Republican, I speak as a woman, I speak as a United States Senator, I speak as an American. So parallel structure, anaphora, but it's also a third one as well, which is the rhetorical device of enumeration, which is a kind of like dramatic, escalating listing
Hmm.
of sorts, which Chase Smith does so perfectly. And many of these speeches I think are so wonderful because Mary Kate, you've created kind of an American canon here. These call forth an American canon, but you have grouped them together in a way that says that we have a lot in common that unites us, even amidst our discord and our polarization. And she ultimately does that as well.
Yeah. How about we'll put up the third poll question, but we'll keep chatting while that goes up, which is what is your favorite speech in the third session on leadership? But I would say to finish your point there, Mike, is I feel like uh, what was so fun about this grouping, the second grouping, is that there were people who stood up to the prevailing winds at the time and said, I think we need to go in a different direction, and made a persuasive case for that. And we need more people doing that now, especially after what's been happening the last week or two. I was at the White House Correspondents' Dinner, and we need people who are making a persuasive case using words, not physical violence. And she certainly did that, as did all four of those speeches. Stood
When
up
I
to what
read
was
her,
going on.
right, when I read her speech too, I was thinking about Lincoln's The House Divided speech. There's something in Margaret Chase Smith that echoes that particular speech from
Mm,
1858. That's when he said, "A house divided against itself cannot stand," and that's actually taken from the Gospel of Matthew. That particular line, and where he says, "Every kingdom divided against itself is brought to desolation. Every city or house divided against itself will not stand."
Mm,
so good.
So
well said.
good. Love those lines.
Yeah. Okay,
Here we
here's
go.
our winners.
Yeah.
Favorite speech in leadership. We have two that are talking about leadership and two that are examples of leadership. So the Franklin Roosevelt getting first place for his example of leadership, and second is let's see, Teddy Roosevelt's Man in the Arena discussing leadership, and then Douglas MacArthur also discussing leadership, and then George W. Bush after 9/11 showing leadership. Uh, so thoughts on those? You want to start us off, Michael?
Yeah, I mean, Roosevelt's lines about fear are so powerful. What it brings up for me is a really misunderstood line about irony. Irony is one of the most misused words in our world. And I think we can approach these looking for the kind of creation of an American canon, but we can also approach these as students and appreciators, kind of with a jeweler's eye about the use of language. And what I love about Roosevelt there, we have nothing to fear but fear itself, is it kind of reverses the audience's expectations. It is a subversion. And irony, really, when we talk about it, is how are we surprising the audience? How are we violating the audience's expectation? And so, as I look at these, and we're talking a lot about the Roosevelts, and TR has two
Mm-hmm.
as the clubhouse leader, and FDR has one very powerful one, among the most powerful inaugural addresses ever delivered. But when we talk about TR from the point of view of what can we learn as appreciators of language, people who have a jeweler's eye for language, there's something about the way that he evokes viscera, the way that he evokes vivid specificity about can you touch and can you taste and can you smell. His language is so immersive. In the muckrake speech, he talks so much about the raking of the filth, and you can almost see it and smell it
Mm-hmm.
and touch it and, God forbid, taste it. Those are the things that come up for me in this section.
How about you, Rob? What's your favorite?
Well, uh, I mean, the FDR speech is amazing. I'm thinking I like that. My dad used to tell me he grew up in the Depression, and he used to tell me the impact of the fireside chats. And this particular speech is just amazing. The notion that it's given at the first inaugural in March of 1933, and the way in which he is framing, we will endure, we will revive, we will prosper. Just some of the vivid language that the Roosevelts, as Michael talked about, is so vivid. We must act and act quickly.
Mm,
My constitutional duty, of course, this is a lot about the expansion of executive power, this particular speech. And I just, as I read this speech, I was thinking about that notion in current affairs and how the executive power is something that is being discussed currently, and how much was expanded by that particular speech. It really was the launch of, of the New Deal, and so much that is part of our modern political landscape was started or kickstarted in that particular speech, I feel.
mm,
So that, and of course, he goes on to say, we have a clear course of duty. They have asked for discipline and direction under leadership. There's just so much richness as a part of that speech that, for me, it speaks to me. So I would go with that. And I don't know what the ranking. Let's see what the ranking is. It's third uh, on AmericanRhetoric.com behind MLK's "I Have a Dream" and JFK's "Inaugural." So I'm going with that.
Okay. I'll go, I'll take a reverse course. I had chosen in advance George W. Bush at the National Cathedral, which came in last place on this list, but I just thought it was beautifully written. I thought it was such a moment in time. I certainly was very concerned that our enemies were going to bomb the cathedral while he was giving the speech, because
Mm.
almost the entire leadership of the US government from both sides of the aisle were in the audience. And so, and I love that it gives me an opportunity as a teacher. All of my students now were born after 9/11 and don't remember it and may or may not know anybody who was involved. And so to be able to tell stories about what was going on in Washington that day and why he said, we're in the middle hour of our grief. And, why, when he said, now come the names, what a gut punch that was, because so many people didn't know the names yet. And the stories, I just thought it was a brilliantly written speech on extremely short notice. And what a speech writing, like you said, the jeweler's eye. That to me, I knew the
Mhm.
guys who wrote it, and it was quite a moment in history. And I think they really captured the moment.
And we're talking a lot about, as you just did, the language, the powerful metaphors and symbolism. And George W. Bush was not renowned as an orator, and he was quite
Right.
maligned as one, but a beautifully delivered speech as well. If you ask somebody, how do you communicate something so somber? Presidents, as Mary Kate well knows, are asked to wear many hats, right? They are legislators, they are commanders in chief, they are constitutional scholars, allegedly. But in many cases, there are pastors. In many cases, there are funeral conductors for national tragedies. And finding a way to communicate in his very plodding, methodical, deliberate, somber tone to suggest and give gravitas to the occasion was a really well done moment in his presidency.
Yeah, that
Okay.
you can really see that eulogy, the format of the eulogy, the praise,
Mm-hmm.
the lament, and consolation
Mhm.
in that speech. And
Yep.
I would assume that we are in the middle hour of our grief. Was that a Michael Gerson?
Yes,
Uh, well, yeah,
I
it was
believe that's
just
correct.
beautifully written. Right.
Yeah. Um, okay, so I have a couple of sort of lightning round questions for you guys that
Mhm.
are sort of open ended. So that's why we couldn't poll our audience on them, but that's okay. So when you think about the rhetorical devices, the language, the metaphors that are in these speeches, which one? Maybe you have more than one, but in short order, what are the ones that stand out to you the most as sort of like you're saying, the jeweler's eye for language? What were the ones that really were at the top of your list? Why don't we start with Rob?
Okay, so well, again, are we talking about this grouping or
Just this
that?
grouping. Yeah, this
Oh,
is
this
the 12 speeches of this half, not the ones that are still to come.
oh, but the 12 speeches. Yeah, I'd
Of
have
the
to
12
go
speeches, right?
right. I'd have to go back to MLK. I mean, think about this: the repetition, the anaphora, "Let freedom ring." He says that 10 times. "I have a dream" 8 times. His dream needs to align with the American dream, and he's just hitting on this, and he's talking about the unalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And it's so much about freedom and equality. We've come to our nation's capital to cash a check. I mean, it's just it, that to me is I don't know who wrote the speech. I haven't really, that's probably something I should ask Ted Sorensen. JFK is one of JFK's speechwriters when the 2 times that I met him. But I don't know who wrote MLK's speech. I assume it was MLK
My understanding
himself.
is he wrote it
Yeah,
a lot of it himself. He had a
Yeah, he
yeah,
wrote it.
committee that helped him of his top leaders like John Lewis and Ralph Abernathy, but I
right.
I believe he wrote all his own. I've never heard of anybody being MLK's speechwriter. Have you, Mike?
No. No, he wrote it, and I think that his metaphors, just to extend Rob's point, exist in three different categories. There's just so many of them. So if we're talking about the most metaphoric speeches, it's got to be King, because I mean we could talk about the man with the muckrake itself as a metaphor. Patrick Henry talks about I have one but one lamp by which my feet are guided, and all employ metaphor. But in some cases, the entire structure of King's speech is really three different metaphoric dichotomies, three different contrasts. Light metaphors contrasted with dark metaphors, low metaphors contrasted with high metaphors, and then hot metaphors contrasted with cool metaphors, all three of which are a metaphoric allusion to the Bible. The hots and cools in the Bible, highs and lows in the Bible, and of course, lights and darks in the Bible. So the kind of imbricated, nested Olympic circles of the metaphors that all give the majesty to King's speech are difficult for any speech to replicate.
Um,
And the geography of the mountain,
Mm.
and just incredible. Yeah.
yeah. The so I will be a little contrary and say I liked all the religious imagery in Patrick Henry,
Mm.
and I think that opened the gates to public speeches having a lot of religious imagery in them, and we see that continuing in Teddy Roosevelt's Muckrake, obviously from Pilgrim's Progress, very religious. Martin Luther King, like you just said, all this biblical imagery. FDR starting his inaugural address with "This is a moment of national consecration." Ted Kennedy did a lot of biblical references in his speech.
Mm.
And obviously George W. Bush did on 9/11, quoting extensively from the Bible. But as time went on, there were less and less saying, "I will now quote from the book of Amos" or whatever. They tend to just launch into it and assume that the audience knows. And so that's been
Mhm.
fun for me as a sort of a researcher to go back and figure out which of this came from the Bible because it's not immediately obvious the way they
That's
frame
right.
it. They don't say, "I will now quote from the Bible." And Martin Luther King does that a lot with, say, the Good Samaritan and the Road to Jericho and the things like that. So
Yeah.
that's what I liked about it was the puzzle pieces putting together where did this come from and why did they reference it that way.
Similar to Lincoln talking very famously about binding up the nation's wounds with these strategic allusions to the Bible. That's one of the things, image-wise, that really stands out to me too. Is King in front of Lincoln, harkening back to Gettysburg, but then Gettysburg, Lincoln is placing himself four score ahead of Thomas Jefferson. So if we talk about the American canon continues itself in the speeches that you have collected, probably no better image that we could talk about. We'll talk about that in a second than the ways in which King does stand in front of Lincoln there, who then
Yes.
stands in front of Jefferson.
So speaking of images, so my next sort of lightning round is what are the most memorable physical images that you saw in some of these episodes that we did that the guys at Night for Night came up with finding these. So here, okay, we could do a quick poll on these. Which images from the series did you like the best of the ones that we're talking about? Young Teddy Roosevelt watching Abraham Lincoln's funeral procession go by his grandfather's house. We have a photo of it. Margaret Chase Smith standing alone in the well of the U.S. Senate, going up against Joe McCarthy. Senator Kennedy having a humorous, very humorous opening to his remarks with Jerry Falwell in front of the moral majority. Or George W. Bush addressing the nation from the National Cathedral, and you could hear a pin drop while he's doing that. Which let's see what our audience says. Which image they like the best. And are there others that are not listed here that you guys liked?
Well, I like the when I think about Jefferson, of course, the inaugural address, and you think that's not on his epitaph, right? But it
Right.
it it's not. But just thinking about his role in writing the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom, which is one of the three clauses on the epitaph. But yeah, I just that you made the point, I think, Mary Kate, that that was a speech written for the mind, not the ear. But the
Yeah.
more that
Yeah.
I go right, the more that I
The
go
eye
back
for
into
the eye,
that,
not the ear. Yeah.
oh, the eye, that not
Right.
the ear. Right, yeah, that's such a powerful. Um, I don't know that speech, and I go back through it. There are some really good moments in that
Mm.
speech where, if had he been a better public speaker, you wonder if he could have brought that to life. I know that there's a lot of accounts that he spoke at a whisper that day, but you
Yeah.
just wonder if it was in the hands of a better orator,
Mm.
and what that
Yeah.
would have been like. And I know it's somewhat dangerous to criticize TJ in any way around the University of Virginia, and I don't mean to do so because he was such an elegant writer, obviously, and such a beautiful speech writer. But yeah, you just wonder had that been in the hands of a better orator, what that speech could have been.
Hmm.
Hmm.
I just always assumed he was a commanding presence physically, but okay, here we go. Our winner is
Interesting.
George W. At the National Cathedral. And
Wow.
uh,
Wow.
so this is, um, and then second place is Margaret Chase Smith.
You're right.
Third place is Teddy Roosevelt watching Lincoln's remains go by. And the fourth is Jerry Falwell and Ted Kennedy yucking it up on stage unexpectedly. Um, any thoughts there, Michael? Other images that you liked, or any of these that jumped out at you?
Well, the ones that are off script really is TR for me because if there was ever somebody who very much fashioned himself and created himself and maybe just was himself, the man in the arena. I mean, my God, he was shot and then continued a speech during
Yeah, remember that?
the 12 campaign, if I recall correctly.
That's correct.
Um, in any case, the ones from this list that stand out to me, I mean, I have so many comments on each of them. The TR waving America's future, waving goodbye to America's past as a child. The poignancy of the moment is hard to overstate. George W. Bush, obviously incredibly powerful. For me, the 9/11 image that Rob talked about earlier with him on the bullhorn on the mound at ground zero also stands as a standout moment there for me. If you're looking for evidence of what is the embodiment of interdenominational or inter-ideological civility, it's tough to overlook Teddy Kennedy and Falwell there. But for me, the image that's really powerful is Margaret Chase Smith because her sitting alone in that theater with the gender politics at play amid McCarthyism, with the advent of the Cold War and the nuclear age. That moment to me is like a Tiananmen Square tank man kind of a moment. The iconicity of the program, the iconicity of the shot itself is just such a poignant place.
Love it. Um, yeah, and I remember, Rob, you and I were talking the other day, you noticing the two spires at the National Cathedral being for St. Peter and St. Paul, and how
Right.
those two did not necessarily get along. And you could see Al Gore not far from Bush, less than a year after the election. Very,
Mhm.
very divisive
That
time in
was the
town.
hanging Chad election.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah.
I agree. The
Yeah, so just such an ecumenical space, I think, that the National Cathedral is supposed to be about. And you're right, having the proximity of Gore so close to that race, sitting there in the audience close to George W. Bush was awfully powerful.
So we've got a question from our audience. In this time of 10-second sound bites and social media clickbait, our past speeches that have had the time to really matter and revered today are lost in an expectation of getting meaningful speeches lost in our polarized times. So the whole question is this all ancient history and we're no longer going to have persuasive speeches? I have some thoughts on that, but I'd love to hear what you guys think.
Two quick thoughts. One, I think that there's just nothing more democratic than making an argument, and especially making an argument together with an audience. There's the sense of togetherness and the vulnerability of the speaker, the tacit respect that the speaker gives the audience by A, making the case in front of them, and B, putting some time and effort into making the case in a kind of Oscar Wilde sense is the most democratic of our forms. And so when we're talking about great American speeches, it's really important to differentiate that between great American reels or great American books or great American tweets or anything of the sort. The second thing is I teach communication and media studies for a living, and so I know the harrowing data about our goldfish attention spans. And I would also just gently offer a place of hope there as well, that long form media is not dead, that being hyper articulate and eloquent is not dead. It may look a little different. It may get slipped up and cut up and spliced up and parsed up into 10, 20, 30-second clips. But long form media is not dead, and there's always a place for the mot juste, right? The bon mot, the most powerful word, the most powerful diction and arrangement. Rhetorical devices have survived for a good reason for 2,500 years or more because there's something really compelling in our human experience that catches our attention. And then that's really the name of the game in democracy is animating people towards your ideas.
How about you, Rob?
Well, just picking up on that theme that Michael talked about in terms of arrangement, and also what he talked about in terms of having hope for the long form and speech making. It wasn't very long ago, Mary Kate, when you were a judge in Richmond for a seven finalist for an oratory competition
Yeah,
where the prompt talked about what Virginian best embodies the Declaration of Independence and the effort that the students put into both the speech writing and the delivery of those speeches in Richmond that weekend was for me was a moment of reflection about wow, we're in pretty good hands.
there's hope.
There's hope. There's a lot of AI out there. There's a lot of sound bites as your questioner posed, and I get where they're coming from, but at the same time, I really do think that our youth know the difference and they want to find opportunities in which to perform their craft both
Hmm.
again of speech writing and of being able to deliver something that is thoughtful. And if we keep encouraging those types of environments in our democracy,
Hmm.
then I do believe there's a little bit of hope.
So here's my response to that question. I get it all the time in class, uh, which you guys are in the same thing. We're all in the classrooms with 18 to 22 year olds, and I think most of them. I would agree without getting political here that our current president and our most recent president were not necessarily great orators. And they remember Barack Obama, but they can't name a Barack Obama speech because they were toddlers, right? And so I think they're not used to great oratory changing the course of history. But that doesn't mean things have to stay this way. And it's going to take good people coming forward who do make persuasive cases to see how this works. But I would also say that if you start with the last 150 years in American history, you saw it go from people behind a podium to the rise of radio, to the rise of television. Then you get to the internet, you get how popular podcasts are right now. There's many different platforms over the course of history, and there will continue to be more platforms, and we can't even predict what some of those platforms will be. But there will always be the need to persuade people and to say where we're going and why. What are the means we all agree to get to the ends that we all want? And so that's that to me is what is motivating here. Is the platforms are going to change, and the question is, can we teach persuasive argument and rhetoric and things like that to change people's minds? So let's begin real quick. We can take one more question. Here we go. Um, uh, the Bible, Pilgrim's Progress. What are the books or speeches that are in common knowledge today that are most quoted? What would you say? Any thoughts on that? What would be easy to
Yeah, yeah,
build shared values on?
I have a bunch of thoughts on that. I spent 10 years writing a book about the books that conservatives most quote. What are the most primary foundational books in the American conservative movement? And if anybody's melatonin isn't working or their Ambien isn't working, I recommend that you buy my book and really get some sleep. But in any case, 15 or so books from 1945 to roughly 1960, ranging from The Case for Conservatism to Hayek, to Goldwater's Conscience of a Conservative, William F. Buckley's God and Man at Yale. In that community, those books and a few others by people like Frank Meyer or Eric Voegelin or Russell Kirk are widely, widely bandied about, sort of handed out like party favors at places like the Heritage Foundation and many other places around the country. And so the celebration level of those books. And then on the libertarian end, I would say Ayn Rand comes up, Fountainhead, Atlas Shrugged, highly quoted. I think, and I would just offer this as a hot take, not as gospel truth, but a hot take is I think that the left in America has more of an oral speech-based canonical culture with people like Eugene Debs, with people like a Lincoln, with people like Martin Luther King than the right does. At least that's the argument I forward in my book. So those are the speeches that I would suggest are hotly quoted as well. And then those books in that specific community come up as well.
How about you, Rob? Any thoughts on commonly shared things people can quote now?
Well, yes, I was struck by King Charles's address to the joint session. I
Which
know
was
we're
actually
talking about
pretty good, I
American
thought.
speeches, but
I was
yeah,
pleasantly
I
surprised.
thought it
Yeah,
was really good
yeah,
actually.
Hmm.
And I
Hmm.
looked at it, I watched it twice actually, and there was that moment of inflection at some point in the speech where he said the Christian faith is a firm anchor and daily inspiration that guides us not only personally, but together as members of our community. And then he goes on to talk about his interfaith relationships. But I just thought that that was so interesting that he took the time at that particular point in the speech and of course, later he kind of ends that whole section of that speech with talking about beating of plowshares into swords, which is kind of a reverse of what you normally hear is, beating swords into plowshares when a military person goes into civilian life. But of course, he's kind of talking about our contemporary age. And I just thought that that was highly interesting language that he used. And yes, and I wasn't expecting much from King Charles actually,
yeah. Who
but
knew? And
he
his toast
delivered.
was good. His toast was very good too.
It
Okay, so
was, yeah.
we're running out of time, but I would love to get sort of the fun thing here. By the way, I think as we look at these speeches that are still coming in Collection B, I would love to hear which ones you guys are most
Mm.
looking forward to. It's a bit of a shameless plug, but that's okay. In the comments, there are people suggesting that we try to get these to the presidential libraries to help us get the word out. I also think if anybody
Mm.
watching can get it to K through 12 teachers, I think that would be wonderful as well. So feel free to share it with your friends. Mike, why don't you start? Which ones are you looking forward to most in our next batch?
The three that you're doing that just captivate me are What to the Slave is the Fourth of July by Frederick Douglass, of course, the Gettysburg Address, the 274 words that redefine the culture,
Yep,
redefine the country, and then my personal favorite of all of them, Robert F. Kennedy, Indianapolis, Pain which falls drop by drop upon the heart, his impromptu funeral oration for King in April of 1968.
quoting Aeschylus off the cuff.
That's right.
Unbelievable.
Excellent.
Who else
Yeah.
can
Yeah.
do that?
Yeah.
Rob, how about you?
Okay. I'm not sure I can just do three.
Okay.
Barbara Jordan, Barbara Jordan's Watergate speech.
Great.
MLK's I've been to the mountaintop. If
Mhm.
no one's ever seen that speech the night
So
before he's
good.
assassinated, wow. Both of Ronald Reagan's speech at the one at Normandy and of course the Challenger after, which was supposed to be the State of the Union
That's
address
right. They
that
canceled the
night,
State
and
of the
he
Union
gave
address that night.
Mhm.
what many people think are the best 4 minutes in TV. That's really where my students get a sense of the how interpersonally connected, even though it's mediated, that Ronald Reagan could be, and start to understand why he was described as, the great communicator. And of course, FDR's a date which will live in infamy, the
Yep.
address on December 8th.
Great. I
Yeah.
would I would say mine are Reagan at Normandy for the reason I said earlier with the sixth grade girls. Second is that whole we're going to do a whole section on the American adventure into space. My one regret on this series is I should have researched in advance that the Artemis was going to take place while we were doing this. And I think there's a great revival in people interested in space travel, and I think those speeches are really fun. And then the last is President Bush, my former boss, at the 50th anniversary of Pearl Harbor, because my students convinced me that I should have one speech in here that I wrote. So you'll hear my personal stories from that about what that experience was like. Okay, so we will hand it back to Althea. Thank you so much, Althea, for allowing us to have this conversation, and
Oh my goodness.
so
This
fun.
was a pleasure. I want to take all three of your classes. I want to sit through lectures. I will take notes and I'll walk away with a wealth of knowledge. This was so fun to kind of eavesdrop on your conversation this afternoon. So thank you all.
Thank you.
You allowed us to pause today and reflect on America's history during this last hour. So thank you. Just a fascinating conversation. So, Mary Kate, Michael, Rob, thank you
Thank
so
you
much
for
for
having
your
us.
time today.
It's been
Thank
an
you.
Thank
honor.
you. Thank you so much.
Audience, thank you for joining us. We appreciate your time and your interest in this program. We invite you to continue to watch the Speaking of America episodes. More episodes will be forthcoming. So if you haven't registered, register right away. And then please join us on June 25th for the final capstone conversation, another conversation with Mary Kate and some friends that she'll invite for that discussion. Also join us for the next upcoming Lifetime Learning webinar, Rethinking Affordable Housing Codes, Design, and Community. And that's on May 12th. Visit our website at engagement.virginia.edu/learn. While there, also check out our Thoughts from the Lawn blogs and other online resources. Thank you again, panelists, for engaging with us this afternoon, and thank you, audience, for being with us. Be well.